Street Fighter II had taken the gaming world by storm in the early 1990s and had become the definition and world leader of the fighting game genre. So much so that it inspired several competitors to come into the genre and create their own takes, like Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, Virtual Fighter, and Tekken to name a few. By 1994, Street Fighter had already established itself as a legendary franchise in the world of gaming, from Street Fighter II to its follow-ups, Champion Edition, Turbo Edition, Super Edition, and Super Turbo. Each subsequent version introduced tweaked gameplay mechanics, speed, animations, and of course new characters, with Super Turbo having a grand total of 17 characters, including the debuting Akuma. You would have thought why this wasn't Street Fighter 3, but as was Capcom's way, especially back in the 1990s, they just had to release updated versions of the same game. As great as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was, as the final installment of the Street Fighter 2 series, when was Street Fighter 3 going to come out and make an appearance? Well, as it turns out, not for a few more years, and after a new iteration of the Street Fighter series. Street Fighter Alpha made its debut on June 22nd, 1995. It was known in Japan, Asia, South America, and Oceania as Street Fighter Zero. It was the first all-new Street Fighter game produced by Capcom since the release of Street Fighter 2 back in 1991. Plot-wise, it serves as a prequel to Street Fighter 2 and features younger versions of the established characters, as well as characters from the original Street Fighters and Final Fight games. Upon seeing this for the first time, I was just thinking, why the name Alpha? Why is this not Street Fighter 3? Until I later learned that the events of this game were set before the events of Street Fighter 2, hence the name Alpha. As both Final Fight and Street Fighter were made by Capcom, this was seen as something of a mini crossover / shared universe with the characters, with both games sharing the same stage. The game introduces several new features, like expanding on the super combo system that was previously featured in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, with Alpha revamping the system by adding a 3-level super combo gauge. Like in Super Turbo, the super combo gauge fills in as the player performs regular and special attacks, and once the gauge reaches level 1 or higher, the player can perform a super combo special move. Now I'm going a little bit too much into Alpha 1, so I'll end this section by saying that this was a new era for Street Fighter with new features and mechanics and new characters, which expanded the already growing universe of Street Fighter. With all the new features, it turns out Alpha 1, in retrospect, was just basically the prototype for its successor, which was to arrive in less than 1 year. Enter Street Fighter Alpha 2, first released on March 25th, 1996 on arcade cabinets. If Alpha 1 was the preview, Alpha 2 was the main course, and in the eyes of many of the Street Fighter fans, this was the real follow-up to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Street Fighter Alpha 2 retains most of the new features introduced in Street Fighter Alpha, like the 3-level combo gauge, the alpha counters, the air blocking, and fall breaking. Alpha 2's main new feature is the inclusion of the custom combo system, the original combo in Japan, and this replaces the chain combos from Alpha 1. In the single player mode, much like Alpha 1, it consists of 8 matches against computer controlled opponents, including a fixed final opponent whose identity depends on the player's selected character. Each character also has a secret rival with whom they face during the course of the single player mode, and after meeting certain requirements, the rival will interrupt one of the player's matches and exchange dialogue with the player's character, and the player's character will then fight the rival instead. The roster has also grown in size as all characters from Alpha 1 return, including the 3 hidden characters of Akuma, Danon, and Bison. Fresh from Street Fighter 2 series, Dhalsim and Zangief make their return. Rolento, a character from the Mad Gear Gang in the Final Fight game, makes his debut here. Jen from the very first Street Fighter makes his proper one-on-one fighting game appearance, and there's also a newcomer, Schoolgirl Sakura, who idolizes Ryu as seen in her move repertoire. A total of 18 characters for the Alpha 2 roster, then a further 2 additions with Evil Ryu and Shin Akuma, super-powered versions of the characters, as they both absorb the dark power of the Satsui Hado. Among my favorite characters to use, Ken and Ryo are Teflon, they're my go-to guys, but others I enjoyed using was Sagat, as his style is somewhat similar to Ryu but different enough. Guy had some great combos, and his Hurricane Kick was my go-to move to combine with various combos. Sakura was the female version of Ryu with her style. Am I using a pattern here with my choice of my favorite characters? She was fun to use but not as powerful as Ryu, but some very cool combos and special moves. Charlie was essentially a Guile clone with all his moves exactly the same, but for some reason in my opinion Charlie appeared cooler when he was pulling them off. Chun-Li is the quintessential female fighter in this series, so it's no surprise that she's still a fan favorite here. I still would have preferred her move execution to be the quarter circle movements rather than the charge moves, but there you go. Adon and Rolento were another duo I liked using. Both had quarter circle movesets, which were my preferred style of executing special moves, which I would incorporate into some heavy hitting combos. Now I'm not an expert by any means with these characters, but they are very fun to use. Now of course the superpowered versions of Ryu and Akuma, Evil Ryu and Shin Akuma, those were the guys I probably used the most. There were guys who I did not really use as much, like Birdie or Sodom or Zangief or Dalsim. These guys were just not my cup of tea, but they did make for very fun CPU opponents. There are 5 different gaming modes in Alpha 2. Arcade mode, your standard one-on-one matches against the CPU on various difficulty levels, taking on rivals and eventually the main boss. Each character has a different final boss amongst the roster. Following completion of arcade mode, there are some short end of game stories for each character. My 2 favorites from these are M. Bison and Charlie's endings, with Charlie about to apprehend Bison but he gets shot and seemingly falls to his doom. He re-emerged in Street Fighter V in a zombie-like state. And then there was M. Bison's story, in which he captures Ryu and attempts to fuse him with psycho power to turn him into his slave. This was somewhat very reminiscent to the Street Fighter 2 animated movie when Ken was captured by Bison and turned into his slave. Versus mode, your basic standard 1 versus 1 with 2 players. On the Sega Saturn version you could choose this mode but set it so one of the players was the CPU, and this mode I used quite a lot when I did not want to go through the long-winded arcade mode, and it is standard now with all the follow-up Street Fighter games that have come along the years. Training mode, very self-explanatory. Train and hone your skills by practicing special moves and combos. Dramatic mode, a unique mode where you can have 2 players face off against a single opponent in the handicap match. I think I might have heard from Toei's Arcade that the Ken and Ryu face off against Bison in the Street Fighter movie heavily inspired this mode. It is a fun mode to play every once in a while and can cause all manner of chaos and mayhem. Survival mode. You select 1 player and you go as far as you can with 1 health bar that never refills, and you can beat as many opponents as you can. It was not my favorite mode to use and I gave up rather quickly when I tried. This is for more skilled and disciplined players who love a good challenge. In terms of its success in Japan, Game Machine listed Street Fighter Alpha 2 on their May 1st 1996 issue as being the most successful arcade game of the month, outperforming titles such as Virtual Fighter. Street Fighter 02, as it was known in Japan, went on to be the highest grossing game in 1996. Game Machine also listed Street Fighter 02 on their October 1st 1996 issue as being the 2nd most successful arcade game of the month. Also in Japan, the arcade magazine Gamist voted Alpha 2 or Street Fighter 02 as the best game of 1996 in the 10th annual grand prize. 02 was also number 1 in the category of best fighting game. The port over to the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 were very successful for their near arcade perfect conversions, with the Saturn version having the advantages owing to frames of animation that were missing from the PlayStation version. The game went on to sell 400,000 units in Japan alone. There is no actual figure on how many units it sold worldwide, but it was considered a big commercial success. The Super Nintendo version was a much less successful port, with the sound quality being very poor, with very choppy animation, and the overambitious graphics caused the game to slow down at agonizingly slow speeds, compounded by bouts of slowdown when you were performing these special moves. Now, given that it was the 16-bit era of console gaming and it was being phased out, and it was now the era of the PlayStation 1, the Sega Saturn and the N64, it's not really all that surprising that the SNES port was of very poor quality. The Alpha series gave a whole new lease of life on the Street Fighter franchise, taking established characters and making them even better and even more well-rounded, and mixing the characters from the first Street Fighter with characters from Final Fight, further expanding the Street Fighter universe. I spent countless hours playing this game, from completing the arcade mode and checking the ending game stories for each character, even the ones I didn't like, so for that I had to go on a simple difficulty just to check their stories. To the Versus mode, to where I played hundreds of matches against the CPU. The other modes I would dabble in every now and then, but it was largely Versus and arcade that were my main go-tos. The success of Alpha 2 was such that there was, in typical 90s Capcom style, going to be a follow-up, which duly arrived in the form of Street Fighter Alpha 3 on July 15th, 1998. But funny enough, before Alpha 3 came out, we finally got Street Fighter 3, which in itself is another story for another video. Of all the games in the Alpha series, Alpha 2 is by far and away my favourite, and it's largely down to nostalgia given how many times I played it over the years from my mid to late teen years. Alpha 1, I actually played properly after I played Alpha 2, and honestly, it felt like a huge downgrade, and it may have subconsciously affected my enjoyment of it. I barely touch it now that I own the Street Fighter 30th collection, because once you played Alpha 2, playing Alpha 1, it, in my opinion, just feels a bit pointless. Now Alpha 3 has way more features and new characters to give it a different feel, and with Alpha 3 making its way onto Capcom Fighting Collection 2, which is the definitive version of this game, maybe, just maybe, I could change my tone on which was the best Alpha game in the series, but in all likeliness, probably not. Alpha 2 is my number one in this series. Street Fighter Alpha 2 is an excellent fighting game with excellent features and great replayability, and the game that took Street Fighter to a brand new chapter following the original series. Alpha 2, an amazing addition to the great legacy of the one-on-one Road Warrior fighting game.
Street Fighter Alpha!